Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse alongside Mr. Martin Popoff. What's up, Martin?
Yes. Morning, sir. Morning, sir. Yeah, ready to roll on this morbid episode. But the weather is broken. It's not so hot anymore, but still fun following what's going on in Phoenix and Las Vegas and all that. Pretty interesting.
And my wife and I were talking about Death Valley this morning and like 130 something degrees. I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I can't. And why people would want to go there just to be a part of that, I have no idea. I don't want to be in 100 degrees, let alone 138 degrees or whatever it was there. It's like, that's craziness. Craziness.
Yeah,
Too
no,
hot.
no
Way
kidding.
too
Yeah.
hot. Yeah, it's not as hot in New York this morning either. It's kind of cloudy, overcast, but I know we got some rain coming in maybe tomorrow or something. So
Yeah.
whatever. It's been a weird summer. It's going to continue. So
All right.
anyway, we've got a the first of a two-part episode today for you that has been requested by one of our viewers, and it's kind of a topic that we've touched on. In fact, I used to do a series on this years ago on the channel, but we only did a handful of episodes. And it's the whole kind of like what if scenario. So what Martin and I decided to do is on the first part today, take a look at some rock stars, musicians who left us way too early and kind of think about what might have been had they would have lived, right? So we've each picked 10. And for part two, we're going to kind of move away from the kind of the death part of it and talk about scenarios where it's band related. What if this band didn't break up? What if this certain lineup stayed together? What if this guy had not left the band? What that sort of thing. More of like kind of like scenarios that are we'll be looking at what could have been had the things stayed aligned as is, or changed or whatnot, as opposed to someone dying. So but today is mainly focused on these young stars who left us way too soon, and probably left behind what could have been a terrific career going forward. Some of them had a terrific career up until they passed, but I think we always tend to think of, well, what would have happened? What if they did not die? So with all that being said, Martin, since we got 10 each, do you want to go back and forth, do you want to do two at a
Yeah.
time?
Sure, we can go back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah. And apologies again. I don't know where this idea came in. It's, you got that problem where it's either a Facebook comment, it's Facebook Messenger, it's email, and then I'm not sure where it came in. So sorry, we're not thanking you by name, but you are appreciated.
And you know who you are. I'm sure
Yes,
we'll see you
for
in the
coming
comments.
up with this. Let us know in the comments who you were, and just say, hey, that was my idea, because this was your idea. So yeah, we split this up. I've always been skeptical of these. Like, there's the odd show that's kind of like support, suggested things like this, and sometimes if the scenario is too goofy, I'm like, well, I don't know what the point of talking about it is. But it was cool breaking it up by this is all deaths, right? So we got 10 each. These are all like, what if this guy didn't die, sort of thing, and what would have happened. And I remember being kind of like inspired that this would be a pretty good idea when someone brought up Phil Lynott. We talked back and forth, so that is one of mine. But I'm actually going to start with this is a band some of you may have heard of. They're called Led Zeppelin. There you go. And there we go. This guy right up here, John Bonham. So, the scenario of John Bonham wouldn't have died. I've often thought it was kind of interesting that I think they would have made an album like Robert Plant's Pictures at 11. It just seems to me that there's this sort of weird throughput from In Through the Outdoor through Pictures at 11, a little bit of Principle of Moments, a little bit the two Firm albums, and a little bit Outrider, right? So I almost feel like Led Zeppelin would have moved with the times. Now we know that In Through the Outdoor was considered more of a Robert and John Paul Jones album. And I think that unfortunately would have considered, because we know Jimmy is a little incapacitated moving quite a few years forward, actually. Yeah. He's not very productive or creatively successful kind of ever again, unless I love Walking into Clarksdale. But other than that, yeah, so I have a feeling that this band would have remained keyboardy, and they may have fallen into some of the traps and moved with the times into an even more less successful version of Led Zeppelin. But then on the other hand, I also feel like what we've learned about Robert Plant and his complete restlessness with direction and band members and all that stuff lately, maybe Robert would have quit after one more album and broken up the band. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think this could go on talking about the what if scenarios with Led Zeppelin. So I think my other point here is like, so what if, say they do another album, and it's kind of more in the line of what Into the Outdoor was, and let's say Robert does get kind of frustrated and wants to go do his own thing, and let's say Jimmy's slide into addiction continues and Bonham says, I want to go do something else. Does Bonham go then and join another band? Does he do a solo career? Can John Bonham do something like that? Yeah. That's kind of interesting, I think, because, what happens, let's just, a weird what if scenario. David Coverdale is looking for a new drummer after Cozy Powell leaves. Does John Bonham get the call? Right? I mean, think of other big bands, Ozzy Osbourne, right? When Ozzy's looking for a new drummer, does Bonham become the kind of drummer for hire, kind of like a Carmine Appice?
I think Bonham joins Saxon and Nigel Glockler's out of a job. That's what.
There you go.
That's right? The new wave of British heavy metal, right?
I mean, Bill Ward drops out and then Bonham joins Sabbath, right? Could you see any of this happening? Maybe. I don't know. I guess I sometimes I think like if Bonham had lived and they could have kept Jimmy kind of on the straight and narrow, could Led Zeppelin have been a force in the 80s? But then you make a good point about, is that really what Plant wants to do at that point? Or do they continue on? And does their music become like Plant solo stuff? I don't know.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
All right. We'll leave it there. We've got 20 to do. So.
I know, right? Yeah, exactly. All right, so I'm going to go with Terry Kath, of course, the late guitar player from Chicago, who, due to a mishap with a gun, right, shot himself in the head, and that was that. And pretty much after Kath passes, Chicago begins this turn into much, much more commercial and pop waters. And I always think, well, what would have happened had he not died to Chicago? And Chicago was already starting to experiment with more radio-friendly material around the time he died anyway. But, the more you kind of read into the whole story, he was really struggling with whether he wanted to stay in the band anyway. I really think what would have happened had he not died is he would have left Chicago by the end of the 70s, probably not long after this album. And he would have became a solo artist or started up his own band. And I really think that where Kath would have gone, not necessarily in the same way, but I look at like someone like a Stevie Ray Vaughan, who was doing this kind of, blues rock thing, singing and playing guitar. We know Kath was a terrific singer as well as guitar player. And I think Terry Kath would have done very, very well for himself as a solo artist. I think he had all the tools to do that. He would have put a crack band behind him. He could have done like rock. He could have done funk and R&B and pop. He could have done whatever he wanted. He had that voice that kind of fit into all those things. So I think that his time in Chicago was probably nearing an end anyway. I think Chicago was going to go the direction they were going to go regardless. It would have been without him, I think, had he lived. So I think that his death robbed the world of us fully realizing all the true talents of Terry Kath on his own. I think it definitely would have happened. So,
yeah, I'm definitely not a fan of Chicago. So
I know you're not. I know you have nothing to say.
Maybe there would have been dueling Chicagos at some point too.
Yeah, you never know. Terry Kath, Chicago, right? Yeah, who knows?
Yeah. All right. Okay, my next one is Kurt Cobain. He's there somewhere there in his iconic sweater. So what would Nirvana have done? I mean, we saw what Pearl Jam did. They just became kind of like a cult band, keeping on making records. The records were still successful, but it was definitely a slide from 10 and Versus sort of thing. Nirvana had already turned in an album that was a slide, and it was a cantankerous sort of ugly album in utero. Maybe they would have continued to be anti-commercial and get even more anti-commercial and then just do even worse, but still do well on the concert circuit. But yeah, we know he had his addiction problems and he had his stomach problems. So, it's almost like maybe if the addiction problems carried on, see, that's kind of an interesting thing with all of these, right? It's like when their addiction problems carry on and they start ticking off people for various reasons, right? Like doing bad in the business or cranky in interviews or not showing up on time on stage and stuff, maybe he would have become an unliked guy, right? Like maybe he would have just become somebody who was annoying and the record sales would have even kept on going down. He loves music. He's a massive musicologist. So you almost get the feeling that there were going to be more records, but I could almost imagine this band slowly, almost like a Pearl Jam, like I say, keeping on making records, but then less and less people sort of care about the records, but yet Pearl Jam is still like a functioning, amazing cult band when they do manage to tour and stuff, and they don't do a lot of interviews and things as well. So yeah, it's interesting. I almost feel like, the legend of Kurt Cobain obviously is because he committed suicide and he's gone, right? And they had this massive album, but if he's still around, and he's still not properly functioning and stuff, does he just become another part of the wallpaper? Does the legend never happen, right?
Yeah, I sometimes think of Cobain and look at some of like the other things that were happening in music after grunge kind of died down, and I sometimes wonder if Cobain would have wound up in kind of like the stoner rock scene a little bit, right? Queens of the Stone Age and Caius and all that kind of stuff, and maybe found a niche for himself there. But again, I think you're right. Based on what we know about him, I think he would have become a recluse, and we would have never heard from him again after like the end of the '90s or whatnot. So I think that he was going to disappear in some shape or form, regardless of whether he decided to kill himself or not. So yeah,
interesting.
All right, my next choice is Steve Gaines from Lynyrd Skynyrd, of course, who passed away in the plane crash. And Martin and I both are going to talk about two guys from this band today, and we'll see if we have different scenarios here. So, of course, this is the final album, the only studio album that he appeared on. And I think it was very evident on this album what a talent he was, not only as a great guitar player, but also songwriter and singer, because he sings a lot of backup vocals on this particular album. And he had a hand in the song, most of the songs on the album. I really think had the plane crash not happened, I firmly believe that Skynyrd would have been the biggest bands on the planet going forward, because I think they, again, who knows what might have happened come 82 or 83 when all those Southern rock bands were putting out really horrible albums that weren't Southern rock at all. But I think that Skynyrd would have gone, possibly not done that. And I think over the next few years, at least into the start of the 80s, I think Skynyrd would have been the biggest band on the planet. And I think, whether they stayed together or not, I think Steve Gaines probably had a very bright career ahead of him, not only as a guitar player, but potentially a songwriter for other people, guesting on other albums, maybe as a solo artist. I think in or out of Skynyrd, I think he was going to be a true star. And it's just a shame that we had such a brief glimpse of that with what he did on this album and the live album with Skynyrd, and that was it. But that's a guy, that's a real shame that any of them lost their lives in this plane crash. But I think for him, because he was one of those great up and coming guys that it's almost like the Randy Rhoads situation, right? It's just, it was not enough. It was so brief, and you're like, oh, what could have been, right? So yeah, Steve Gaines.
All right, more on that one later.
Yep.
Okay, next I'm gonna go with Dimebag Darrell.
Oh, yeah.
So I have a feeling that what would have happened here, I mean, I think Dime and Vinny were both gaining weight and drinking a lot. And Damage Plan wasn't doing all that great. I have a feeling that a Pantera reunion would have been around the corner, and there would have been like a lot of money on the table, and there would have been like you guys got to shape up sort of thing, and they probably would have responded to that. Maybe Zach would have helped Dime with sobriety, and they would have helped each other. But I just feel like eventually you were going to get a Pantera reunion, and Zach wouldn't have a job right now because Dime would be doing it, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they'd both be in the band for all we know. Who knows? But no, I don't think so. But I just have a feeling they would have patched things up eventually. And we would have seen more from them, and maybe we wouldn't have lost either of them. And they probably would have gone and made a record or two, and they wouldn't have been all that greatly received, because none of these reunion albums are ever much of a you think of Soundgarden, Alice in Chains. I mean, they're just not super appreciated when they happen, but they would have still been a big touring act, and they would have had these records. So yeah, we would have had both of these guys still.
Do you think he ever would have gotten involved in Down, or is that just too much of a Pantera reunion right there?
Yeah, no, I think that thing would have been kept separately.
And
But
that's not really his style, right? I mean, he's not that kind of,
no,
not his niche.
no, and I mean that they've got a clear, the Pepper situation there. But yeah, it's I think the interesting thing is if he could patch it up with Phil, and does Phil keep saying incendiary things? Does he start putting out putting out let's have a reunion sort of situation. Let's bridge, water under the bridge sort of thing. So yeah, that would have been the main thing there, because yeah, Phil at this point was not exactly calling for a Pantera reunion either, but I think just the industry would have called for one.
Yeah. Here's another weird idea. How about somewhere down the road, he gets the call from Ozzy and becomes Ozzy's guitar player for a couple albums and tours.
Yeah, then they probably both would have been dead then after that.
Yeah. All right. My next choice is Rory Gallagher. This is his last album, 1990, and you have to wonder. Of course, Gary Moore had some big success with "Still Got the Blues" shortly thereafter, and of course, Stevie Ray was very popular until his death. You have to wonder if that at some point in time, Rory would have finally caught on with the masses as a blues guitar, icon or whatnot, which he should have been. It always seemed like Rory's music was never quite hip at that particular time, a little bit in the 70s, but I'm wondering if in the 90s, maybe he would have caught on with either, doing the blues stuff, or maybe moving into kind of like jazzier realms and smooth jazz and things like that. You have to wonder if at some point in time he might have caught on, but I think more importantly, it'd be great to have him around as one of the legends of blues guitar all these years later. And I think that, now everybody, you talk about Rory, and it's like, oh, one of the greatest of all time that just never really had the success of anybody else. And I always think if he would have lived, he would have gotten that moment at some point in time, whether it be, they give him a Grammy or something to really allow him to recognize all that he did over the years, but never really fully appreciated. I think that there was that moment for him, and maybe he does like an all-star collaboration somewhere down the road that brings some attention to him. I don't know. It's just a shame that this guy, who's so well respected by musicians and, people who know a lot about guitar, never really got the mainstream acceptance that he should have. So, but yeah, Rory Gallagher.
Yeah, interesting. So we lost him in 1995, age of 47. He had liver failure, but he was on a lot of medications for a lot of stuff. But the big thing about him is he developed a fear of flying later in life, right? And so that would have limited his prospects. But I love your idea, because I think, yeah, he could have been a guy who could have had that Stevie Ray Vaughan, Gary Moore type of breakout hit, and just be this respected guy in the blues market, showing up on people's records, and just slowly rising to that halfways to that Jeff Beck sort of legendary status. Yeah. Loved his voice too. I mean, that's a great thing.
Oh, so unique, right? Yeah. Oh yeah.
Just loved his singing as much or more than the guitar playing and stuff, and the songs. I loved the songs too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially that whole stage struck photo finish, right? I think it's called Top Priority.
Stage struck is so good. Such a great.
I love Top Priority with Bad Penny and all that. Just left town, just hit town. Yeah. So that whole period of the late 70s into the early 80s is my favorite. Where yeah, I just love listening to the guy sing. It was amazing, his voice.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So my next choice is well, yeah, speaking of, so this kind of fits in the same thing. We've got Gary Moore.
There you go.
So yeah, Gary Moore, every time I think of his death, I think of like There But for the Grace of God Go I, with the whole thing of just like, just dying from being old and drinking slightly too much one time, sort of thing, right? And having your heart stop on you, right? Because your blood gets too thick, right? And that feels like what happened to Gary, essentially. But yeah, you know, he was not too old, not too young. But the interesting thing why I wanted to pick him is that I stumbled across, because I'm working on a couple of different Thin Lizzy things, but I stumbled across one of those tribute things where he's up there doing Thin Lizzy songs. And it was all guests and stuff. He's with Scott and everything. And I'm thinking, you know, he reminds me of a Cozy Powell and a Phil Collins, in that he's a leader. He's just a born leader. He's an opinionated guy. He's a talented guy. And I just feel like we would have got a new version of Thin Lizzy with him fronting it, and it would have had more validity than even the John Sykes version. Maybe even would have had John in the band, right? Like he's just, well, maybe not. I mean, it would probably be him and Scott. It would probably be all the right people. And I almost feel like, you know, given hammering the masses and going out and doing a good job, and him singing, because that's what he was doing in this tribute thing that I watched. You know, he's singing, he's doing a great job. He's got those frontman skills. I think over time, you might have even had him as accepted as the leader of Thin Lizzy, that you might even got them making studio albums or whatever. But I certainly feel that he could have led a pretty valid reformed version of Thin Lizzy, even though he wasn't really that, you know, that long a Thin Lizzy member, or that many times a Thin Lizzy member. I think basically he's the one guy that people would have said, you know, you can come in here and lead the band somewhat like Phil led the band.
I think because they had that relationship together, even though they weren't together in the band for that long, I think those two guys were really good friends for such a long time. I think that the fans understand that and would have accepted that.
Yeah.
And, you know, whether it was Thin Lizzy or something else, I definitely think that at the time of his passing, he was ready to kind of dip back into rock waters from all the blues stuff. Mm-hmm. So, all right, my next choice is Steve Marriott, a guy who I think was kind of on top of the world in some aspects, the late 60s into kind of like the mid 70s. And yeah, the latter part of the decade wasn't really too good for him. You know, Humble Pie's status was kind of shrinking. He did a solo album. You know, he had lots of issues with alcohol, and you know, we got some kind of subpar, somewhat crappy Humble Pie albums late in the decade, and of course then we lost him, of course. But I really think that had Steve lived, he was a guy who was probably primed for a solo career. If he had the motivation, I think, you know, things like, you know, Live Aid, maybe we would have seen, you know, a revamped Small Faces or Humble Pie maybe play at Live Aid to kind of get them back out into the limelight with people. He would have, I think, worked with other musicians. I think, you know, Steve Marriott would have been the guy. You know, you need a guy to come on and do guest vocals on an album, you call Steve. You need a guy to play some guitar on an album, call Steve. And I think he would have over time become the legendary figure that he probably always should have been anyway. Because I think that, like, everybody talks about Steve Marriott and they know of his greatness, but they're always like, oh, but, you know, yeah, his descent into what he descended into is pretty sad. And I think if you take out that sad part and let him continue on with his career, you know, maybe he does it with Humble Pie, maybe not. You know, does Humble Pie, does he decide to go maybe put the band back together and get a little heavy and kind of jump into the new wave of British heavy metal or something like that? Who knows? I don't know. Could he have had it in him? Possibly. But I think that Steve Marriott definitely still had lots more to give the music world, and I think it obviously got cut too short. But yeah, Steve Marriott, my next choice.
Yeah, for the record, we lost him in 1991, right? There was a night of heavy drinking and being out, and then he basically went back to his own, took a taxi from the one place to the other place. He was in his cottage, I think it was, and there was a big fire. Just the place totally burned to the ground, right? He was
yeah,
fire. So
yeah, because the whole 80s was just like, it's just like an abyss for him, right? I mean, he just kind of like disappeared off the map. So, you know, I guess if we're doing this what if scenario, so what if like the drinking didn't like overtake his life towards the end of the 70s? I don't know. Yeah, because I mean, there's so much he could have done throughout the decade had he not descended into his own personal hell like this. So yeah.
I think he would have joined the Joe Perry project. That would have been
Hey, why not, right? You
perfect
know,
for him. Yeah.
why not? Hey, how about this weird scenario, Martin? So Derek St. Holmes leaves Ted Nugent, in comes Steve Marriott.
Yeah,
Imagine like a Steve
exactly.
Marriott guy playing, singing with Ted Nugent.
Yeah. And he would have definitely had to shape up to be in Ted's band, that's for sure.
Oh, you did. Yeah.
He wouldn't have put up with anything. So yeah, yeah. All right, my fifth choice is Phil Lynott. So this is the one that's somewhat inspired me, thinking, there might be some good stuff to talk about here. But yeah, so I remember a Facebook comment saying, "Oh, what would Phil would have done afterwards," sort of thing. And because I think you and I even talked about this a little bit, maybe. But given that Grand Slam wasn't really sounding all that great, it was a little keyboardy and modern, and it was kind of doing a little bit of that twisted British version of trying to be a hair metal band a little bit. I have a feeling that had he lived, maybe Grand Slam wouldn't have been that great, and we would quickly see a Thin Lizzy situation. I think he was still getting along with John Sykes, so maybe we would have got another Thunder and Lightning type album. Maybe John Sykes wouldn't have gone on to Whitesnake, and there would be no Whitesnake narrative as we know it. Big fancy narrative that we get there.
Yeah.
But I kind of pushed back and said, I think there's a good chance we might have got some crappy albums out of Phil, whether it was with Grand Slam or I kind of said that I could see them going a little bit the ain't misbehaving, misdemeanor, high stakes and dangerous men route, and giving us kind of a crappy album or two in the 80s sort of thing, because he loved his fame. He was enthusiastic about new music, and he could probably be convinced of the merits of synthesizers and technology and stuff, and say, hey, why don't you go try be this kind of a star, right? And bad things could have happened.
Maybe he does an album with Phil Mogg and they do their own version of a Springsteen album together.
Yeah, right. That would have been cool. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, for a lot of these guys, I think the what if scenario has to be, if they did live, and can they get cleaned up, right? And can they go, I mean, that's like the Marriott thing, right? It's like, it's in order for him to do anything of note, I think he would have to clean up. Same thing with Phil. Because I think that unless he gets his life back together, I think, what we saw briefly with Grand Slam is just, it would have been more of that kind of stuff, I think. He needed to be motivated and need to be clean. So I don't know. But yeah, what a talent. I think that all the great stuff we saw in Thin Lizzy and even some of the really cool stuff from those solo albums, I think that he would have had some greatness in him still. But, got to get his life back on track, I think, for that to happen.
Yep.
All right, my next pick is Glenn Buxton from the Alice Cooper Group. This is a perfect scenario of how much was he contributing to those last couple of Alice albums anyway, right? Obviously, the early part of the catalog, there's some tremendous guitar playing there, and I think he was just a type of player who could really fit into any scenario. He could do the heavy rock stuff. He can do more straight rock. He could do the kind of like psychedelic punk stuff. I mean, he basically fits in everywhere. Good riff guy, pretty good soloist, not tremendous, but he had the look. The it factor was all about him. But I don't know if he stays clean. Does he go on with the rest of the guys to the $1 Billion Babies band? Does that make that any better? I don't know. I have this feeling that regardless of whether he lived or not, I'm not convinced that Glenn Buxton would have been much of anything after the Alice Cooper Group. This is like one of the ones I think that I'm going to talk about where I'm not really sure that there is a bright anything for him after Alice kind of went off on his own. So I don't know. Did he have, Martin, do you think Glenn ever had enough motivation to go and do his own thing? Does he join another band if he stays kind of sober and doesn't, pass away when he did? I don't know. I'm not convinced. He's like one of the
I would agree with you, but I think maybe the more interesting scenario is if he stays clean, in 72 and 73, does Alice even ever go solo, right? I mean, maybe the band like that takes out probably 50 or 60% of the drama in the band. and all
Yeah.
of a sudden, it's running like a much better, well-oiled machine. And Alice keeps being a group led by someone called Alice Cooper, and they probably maintain their popularity through the rest of the 70s. I would say no problem. Although we see, there's this whole thing when hard rock maybe becomes a little out of vogue or whatever. But I think Alice kind of, if you think about it, the Alice Cooper group, which had so much social currency built up through those early 70s, they missed the golden period of their kind of music. I mean, their kind of music, or put it this way, if they would have gotten a little heavier. But you think of the massive success of Ted Nugent, Aerosmith, and Kiss from 76 through to 78. Imagine if the group would have stayed together through 78. They would have had some huge albums.
Yeah. And does part of this hinge on Alice himself, right? And him being able to keep with it, and because he went through some rough times in the latter part of the decade. So I don't know. I think I agree with you. Is this a better? I mean, I don't dislike Muscle Love, but could this been a better album with a little bit more input and energy from Glenn? Right? Possible. Do they stay together? Yeah, because I think that the Alice Cooper group were tailor made for that time period you just mentioned.
Yeah,
and it wasn't to be.
All right, my next choice is Queen, and this guy right here, Freddie Mercury. So, had he lived, I think they built up some goodwill again with Innuendo. It was a pretty well liked album. I think personally it's a pretty good album. I think it's overrated. I think people go more and more, they just kind of the narrative ossifies that it's a masterpiece of some sort. But yeah, after The Miracle and all that, and it's kind of magic and everything, it's definitely a huge improvement. But it's still got quite a few songs of that type, and they aren't all like Innuendo or The Show Must Go On, right? But anyways, I think what I pondering this situation, seeing what happened with Queen afterwards, which is such a disappointment of just being a tribute act to themselves kind of thing. I feel like this band turns out to be a band with no leaders, but with Freddie in there was at least enough energy that they could all, even though none of the four of them are particularly leaders, with Freddie still in the band, they could still move forward and function as they did in the 80s, more or less. But I think they still would have carried forward and been an insanely huge band and kept being as big as they were. The biggest band ever in the UK essentially is what a lot of people say now, right? They basically say that the biggest band the UK ever had, which is saying something because obviously the Beatles loom in there somewhere, right?
Right.
But yeah, imagine following up Innuendo with another good album with some heaviness on it, again with a good mix, and then another and another, and they would have still been a massive band, I think.
Do you think Freddie ever makes that kind of solo album splash that he always wanted in the 90s, perhaps?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like maybe that has passed, and he's had a bad taste in his mouth because of the experience of him not being that great a solo act anyways. I think he loves fame and he loved the money, and I'm sure he would have loved the accolades that Innuendo was getting. But yeah, I think one of the greatest things about it is we wouldn't have had this super disappointing version of Queen that we ended up getting, right? With which just endless reissues and trying things with Paul Rodgers and what's his name?
Adam Lambert.
Lambert, that's it. Adam Lambert. And no albums at all. So that would have been the greatest thing, is this amazing band would have kept making albums. But yeah, we've had so much disappointment in just a lot of talent basically squandered.
I could see Freddie getting into acting at some point if he were still around.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but I definitely think that would have been something he would have done.
Yeah.
All right. Ray Gillen. Of course, the last official Badlands release. Mm-hmm. 2 really good albums, of the third, if you count the third one that it's readily available now. But I think he had all the tools to be one of the great singers. He had the look, he had the voice, he had the attitude, he could write songs. I think he probably in Badlands and, his brief time in Sabbath. I think he was never in the right place at the right time. But I sometimes wonder if Ray could have done something along the lines of kind of like what Chris Cornell was doing in Soundgarden that would have taken him through the 90s in a big way. I definitely think that at some point in time, had he lived, he would have either started up a new band that would have been with the times and would have latched on with people, or he would have put together another kind of super group like this. I'm not saying Badlands would have continued on, because I think that they were another band that probably the timing of them was not really right. But I think that if today, he would be one of the most respected hard rock metal singers on the planet. But I think that certain situations would have had to present itself to him. But I could totally see him doing another kind of super group with a superhuman guitar player and a dynamite rhythm section, and really making a name for themselves. Like I said, maybe he does something that's kind of like Soundgarden-y, and that'll take him through the 90s. Maybe he latches on to some metal guys late in the decade. I don't really know. But I think that one of the biggest shames is that we lost him all too soon, and really his output that we have from him is like next to nothing when you really think about it. I mean, there's a reason why Jakey Lee sought him out. There's a reason why Tony Iommi picked him. There's a reason why he almost got the spot in Blue Murder, right? I mean, the guy had the goods. So I think it's a terrible waste. And yeah, I think you can come up with a million different scenarios of who we might have hooked up with down the road, but I think I'm pretty sure maybe he would have wound up in Black Sabbath again. Who knows, Martin? But I think we would have seen Ray Gillen somewhere in the spotlight after he passed away.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm more pessimistic about it. I mean, the brightest thing I think would be, I'd agree with you, maybe he would have ended up in Sabbath again. But you wonder if just his whole style and what he was kind of goes out of vogue, and he just becomes another guy operating in that mid-tier thing, being in super groups, but nobody really cares. Or Badlands continues for 2 or 3 more albums and nobody really cares. So you wonder, I mean, as the 90s is wearing on, there aren't too many happy stories of these guys who are from that world, who aren't already massive stars doing all that great, right? So he could have just been another guy who's always around, showing up on all the tribute albums, all that kind of stuff, singing, right?
He'd be in a band on Frontiers Records right now, probably.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the perfect way of putting it, right? So here's another guy who was a little more famous than Ray, Elvis Presley.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. So some of you may have heard of this guy. So basically, interesting scenario. I feel like almost what we just said about Ray would feel the same way about Elvis. It's like he's not of the time. He's dying at a strange time, 1977. Like he's just sort of on the Borscht Belt circuit sort of thing, and I wonder if he continues along that kind of thing. I think maybe he in the 80s he shows up on dance hits, and he's just this novelty guy that shows up on he's doing duets with people. He's Dolly Parton and or even Cyndi Lauper and Chrissie Hynde, and so like I could see him doing lots of duets with lots of different versions of talent share throughout the years. Eventually he's doing records with Rick Rubin and going back to his roots and all this stuff, and having some new popularity with the Johnny Cash type thing. Maybe he just keeps going. He keeps being so out that he's finally in again in the middle of the 90s or something, right? So he's kind of always around, but I just wonder if every time we see him have a hit ever again, it's a novelty situation.
It could be. Yeah, I also see him in that same light, and I think that he would have been a guy. He's got a Las Vegas residency somewhere, and he's because how old would he have been today? What was he, like 30?
He was 42, I think, when he died, something like
30,
that, right? In
yeah.
77. Does that ring a bell? Is that possible? I guess it's possible. No, would he have been that old? I
thought he was 38, but it's somewhere
okay.
around there. It's somewhere.
Yeah, he's getting on. So but so he still had, in the 90s, he would have been in his 50s or something.
Yeah.
Right? So
I could definitely see him just doing his gigs in Vegas, at some ritzy hotel there, and just occasionally doing a duet with someone guesting on an album, putting an album out every so often. And I think he would become one of those like kind of like legends that you almost like take for granted. It's like Elvis is always here. Oh, Elvis is always involved in something. And we love him, but he's Elvis, right? Yeah.
Getting together with the latest massive hit guy, it's like, oh, I get to do a song with Elvis now because I'm famous, right? Or whatever, right? With this the Dave Grohl time and the whatever, maybe even Sebastian Bach.
You never know. Elvis does this heavy metal album, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
You never know. Duane Allman. So another one of those guys that his quick rise to stardom and then bloop, he's gone in that motorcycle accident. I really think that so of course his last album with the Allmans is the Eat a Peach album. He died in the accident in the middle of recording this album, so he's on this a little bit of the studio stuff, and then of course you got the live stuff from the Fillmore on here, and then of course Brothers and Sisters is the first full album after they decide to carry on without him. And this is very different. This is less of kind of like a blues rock album, like the three studio albums that he appeared on beforehand. There's a lot more kind of country rock influences on here. We got Dickie Betts kind of taking up the reins and really driving the band at this time, because of course Greg is a mess at this point. But I think if he would have lived, the Brothers would have continued musically down the same road that they were doing. And you just have to wonder, what a powerhouse they could have been. I mean, they were anyway, but like alongside kind of like Skynyrd, really carrying that Southern rock kind of flag. But I think more interestingly, it's like I always look at like Layla, the album that he appeared on, and I think that kind of dynamic he had with Eric Clapton. And I sometimes wonder, had Duane lived, if he would have done a lot more stuff like this, where he would have done lots of collaborations with his heroes and become a legendary figure all on his own, where maybe he didn't need to be in the Allman Brothers anymore, or he had such a busy career going solo, guesting, and with the Allman Brothers band, that he would have been like I said, one of the most massive American guitar players that we've ever produced here. So I can see him doing like collaborations with Tina Turner, and I can see him doing stuff with like B.B. King and all the great bluesmen. I think this guy would have worked with everybody, because I think he had that nature to him that he just wanted to collaborate and make music. And unfortunately, the motorcycle accident, and he, again, another one of those guys massively involved in drugs at the time, so he would have had to kind of get over that too. Would he have survived the 70s if he didn't get in the motorcycle accident? I don't know. That's not for me to say, but I definitely think he would have done all sorts of things and would have been like a Grammy nominated artist and all that kind of stuff. I think the accolades would have been all over the place for Duane had he lived.
Yeah, like a Carlos Santana.
Yep.
Yeah, or Eric Clapton solo all through those years, right?
Yep.
Yeah, he would have been big like that. All the big famous lead singers. He would have been very mainstream. I think he would have just been part of the rock mainstream, the royalty.
Yeah. Yep. I agree.
Yeah. Okay, my next one is Ronnie Van Zant. And I'm prepared to be more pessimistic than you were about this situation. I think all I could think of was them going kind of keyboardy and radio poppy, like middle period Molly Hatchet and 38 Special and God forbid Blackfoot, of course. But I would say that another interesting thing is maybe Molly Hatchet wouldn't have been as successful as the replacement for Skynyrd, essentially in that sort of nice 78 through to 82 period, right? Maybe this still would have been the big band sort of sucking up all the oxygen in the Southern rock room, and they would have had one or two more, pretty big albums. And
well, that's what I'm thinking, because there still was that couple of year period. I kind of agree with you, Martin. I think from 82 or 83, they probably would have done what a lot of the other bands were doing, but they still had a handful of years there where they really could have made a big impact, if they were cranking out an album a year or so.
Yeah. But credit to them. I mean, even when they did come back and stuff, I mean, they've just been a very good, pure, solid Southern rock band, and all their later stuff is good as well. And even when they could have gone down to they weren't around for the worst part of it, but they basically never screwed up. I mean everything they've done has been pretty darn creditable, I suppose. But I just feel the drugs and the drink causes laziness and lack of focus. And I think they could have been pushed around in 1983 and 1984 to add Ken Hensley to the band to provide those keyboards. Not that Ken was that kind of guy. He just, I could just see him being that kind of guy, like a little bit of what happened to Blackfoot sort of thing. But, yeah, I think we would have got some crappy albums out of these guys, but I can just see them on part of like massive package bills in 1979 and 80 and 81, right? And being on Black and Blue instead of Molly Hatchet, right? Sort of thing. Yeah, there you go.
And I think Ronnie himself becomes like a legendary figure. Like I don't know, I could just see him if he was still around today. He is like the father figure of Southern rock and the guy. Because is there the guy right now?
I can see him acting too, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I could see him doing like the Henry Rollins thing, right? Because he's got that attitude, right? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, Cliff Burton is my next pick. Of course, bass player for Metallica who died in that horrible accident in Europe while they were out on tour, right? Terrible. This is the last studio album with Cliff on bass. I really feel very strongly that Cliff was, out of all the guys in Metallica, he was the torchbearer for underground metal. And I sometimes wonder if he had still been in the band, this might have still sounded kind of like it does. I don't know, Martin, if we would have gotten this in exactly the way that it is had Cliff still been in the band, because I think that Cliff was the rebel in this band. I think out of all of them really cared about all that underground heavy extreme stuff that was coming out of the woodwork when Metallica was really starting to break. There was a virtuosity and an experimentation part of his bass playing that I think would have had a big impact. Would we have ever said, I don't hear the bass on this album if Cliff Burton was in the band? I don't think so. Right. And there was just this kind of element of danger with Cliff Burton that I think the band kind of really missed after he left the band. It's kind of like the Richie Blackmore situation, that I always got that he seemed to me like that kind of guy. So I don't know. Does Metallica go down the road they go in the 90s if Cliff Burton is in the band? I don't know. Maybe the record label dictates that, but I don't see Cliff wanting to do that. I just see him as wanting to kind of keep the flag waving for true underground metal, regardless of all the success. And unfortunately, we'll never know. But that's kind of how I think he either would have left to go do something else. I can just go see him leaving to go join, whatever, Death or something like that in the early mid 90s and saying, I'm not into what Metallica's doing anymore. I don't see him fitting in with the load stuff and all that. It just doesn't seem to be his thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think you still retain another strong, opinionated songwriter, song melody guy in the band. So we didn't really get that. Jason was a brilliant choice in so many ways. Yep. He loved metal too, and he looked great and all that stuff. He played the part. He was a faithful soldier. But I don't think they really gave him a songwriting role, right? So I think maybe we would have got much stronger songs still on the next couple of albums. Although, Black Album is about songwriting, right? More than anything. So yeah, that's kind of the situation. But, you got to say both Robert and Jason were amazing choices to bring in. I mean, they just did a really good job of, unfortunately, and the other thing, I hate to say it, but I would think some of the continuing boost of fame was this shocking story that happened to the band. So I think Cliff dying probably even helped keep them in the news and keep the story moving forward, like this drama of how he died and that he died. Sort of thing. So, would Justice have sold as many, being such an obscure, strange album? It was a double album at the time on vinyl.
Yeah, big, long, lumbering songs and whatnot. Yeah.
Would that have done as well and kept things going to, that they were still going to be talked about as much when they got to the Black Album, which is very accessible, and you can understand why that was huge. But would they have lasted through that period without that extra shocking storyline that, publicists like, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, my next choice. I don't got any answers for this one. It's I was trying to think of what would happen, but Van Halen, had Eddie Van Halen lived. I just feel like I really have no idea what to say. To me, the drama would have continued. I have no idea if they could have made another record with Sammy. I think that's less likely than making another record with Dave, but even I think that might even have been unlikely at this point after, sort of the bad vibes that happened around the live album, right? That whole thing. So the sniping sort of continued. Eddie still didn't seem, that he'd turned himself around in terms of wanting to make lots of records and music. He was still kind of reclusive and that gearhead and the guy who just loved to play for himself sort of thing. So I'm not sure what would have happened. I mean, I feel like the strong bond with Wolfgang might have caused him to be in a band with Wolfgang that wasn't called Van Halen. That's quite possible. He could have been part of Mammoth, right? Situation, or had a band with him and maybe with Alex and yeah, maybe a different lead singer and they move forward and they don't call it Van Halen or something, or maybe they do call it Van Halen and have a different singer. So that could have happened as well. So yeah, I just don't really have any answers because it's just such a baffling situation, that whole Sammy and Dave and Eddie and the whole story that basically starts unraveling in Van Halen around the time of the first live album. Soon as that happens, live right here, right now, it's kind of a Guns N' Roses story for the whole rest of the career, right?
Yeah, it's amazing when you think about how many years we went with nothing from Van Halen. It's like I think the experiment with Gary just kind of backfired on them, and I think Eddie and Alex were probably gun shy of adding another singer that wasn't either Sammy or Dave. And, had the songwriting well run dry? I don't know. It's arguable. Why could he not do a solo album in all those years? No idea. Had he lived, would we have ever gotten that? I don't know. There's no indication that we would have. I agree with you. I think that he would have done something with his son, whether it's Van Halen or whether it's something else. But we'll never know now, unfortunately.
Yep.
I think the unpredictability of David Lee Roth kind of prevented them from doing another album. And I still think there was some bad blood between Sammy and them. So as much as Sammy tries to downplay that, I don't know if that was ever going to happen.
Yeah.
All right, David Byron from Uriah Heep. Of course, High and Mighty is the last album with him on vocals. And then, of course, he is replaced by John Lawton for Firefly. And John does 3 studio albums with the band. Then, of course, he leaves and they do another album with neither one of those guys. That led the Conquest album that lasted 1 album. And then Heep goes on a little bit of a hiatus, and Mick Box puts together a brand new revitalized version of Uriah Heep for Abominog. In the meantime, during all that, we get was it Rough Diamonds, which is kind of like
Rough
a super
Diamond singular, I think. Yeah.
Rough Diamond, yeah, with Clem Clemson and a bunch of other guys. That doesn't do really much business. Of course, Dave's got a massive alcohol problem, and one of the reasons for his downfall. Did he actually do a solo album, Mark?
I think there's David Byron band Take No Prisoners.
Yeah, which did nothing.
Is there even one more? Oh,
there might be. Yeah, just goes to show you how low profile those were, and then before you know it, he's gone. I really think that somewhere down the road, we might have gotten a reunion between Mick and Dave to do another Uriah Heep album, maybe possibly at the end of the Peter Golby era, like a Quater time period. I don't know. I think there was some bridges burned there. So maybe it could have happened earlier. I have no idea. But, a really good, unique singer that just, if he had lived, my guess is he probably would have been doing some other collaborations with other folks, trying to put together another band, kind of like Rough Diamond. And whether it would have been success or not, I don't know. For this guy, his best years were obviously those first like 5 or 6 Uriah Heep albums. And so again, another guy that it's hard to predict where he would have gone, because, the things he did after Heep were just kind of very ordinary sounding. So I don't know what he had in him away from Uriah Heep, the main band. That's kind of my biggest question is like, could he have done something else of prominence outside of this band where he was a perfect fit? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the brightest thing that would have happened would have been some sort of reunion. Maybe some big promoter in Germany got them together to revive the career, or maybe right in Britain or whatever. So yeah, they could have been they could have had a Perfect Strangers type situation. Maybe not as big as that, but possibly they could have got a gold record with a nice reunion along the way. But yeah,
Yeah.
you think of all the vocalists they went through. It's like I'm sure it's I would imagine it crossed their mind, like crossed somebody's mind, management mind, the whole time. Like, get
Yeah.
Dave back in this, right?
I think they would have had to do it for Conquest, right? So instead of picking John Sloman, because Ken Hensley was still in the band for that album. So I think you got to do it then. Because I think when Ken leaves the band, is it enough to just bring David back? I don't know. I think if you want to get as close to that classic lineup as possible, you have to do it for Conquest after Lawton leaves, right? But
Yeah.
you know.
But yeah, the boozing starts pretty early, and you also, even when he's still in the band, he is having problems singing live, right? I mean, that's almost a whole nother show there. Like these vocalists that we just consider amazing vocalists, there's a lot of those guys who are amazing vocalists on those albums, and we love them to death, but who always had a problem with singing live, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting that there are a few guys like that and I think he was a little bit like that, but that was probably, something to do with the excessive partying and staying up too late and all that stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right. So my last choice is Randy Rhoads. This guy right there being lofted by Ozzy, right? So, had he lived, yeah, he died of no fault of his own, no misadventure on his part, in terms of drugs or drink or whatever. Just a shocking, stupid drive-by, fly-by prank thing. But had he lived, there was already talk of him wanting to be a classical artist, leave the band or whatever. And I know I've mentioned this, but I remember interviewing Tommy Aldridge, and he told me the shocking story that he says, yeah, we were all at breakfast one morning, sitting in the Denny's or whatever, and we're all sitting there just having our breakfast, and Randy was, talking about leaving the band. He says Ozzy reached across and smacked him as hard as he could, slapped him right across the face, right? So it's like there's obviously some sort of abuse and bullying, going on, even just to keep him in the band. If I'm to extrapolate that one incident further, don't know if that's valid or not, but that's the story Tommy told me. So yeah, you imagine he wanted to do more things. He got to be a classical artist inside the Aussie band. So I would think he was still self-actualized and pleased with what he had done on these records. He certainly didn't really get to do that in the goofy version of Quiet Riot, right? So I think he probably could have been persuaded to stick around. I don't know how long that would have happened. He probably would have been doing solo albums on the side, and Ozzy and Sharon probably would have been fine with that if the agreement was, that he stays in the band and does more things. But yeah, the great shame is obviously him dying for his own, family and personal reasons, but also look at all that amazing guitar work we didn't get throughout the 80s. He could have contributed so much more on the guitar.
Yeah, I could see him doing one more album with Ozzy and then moving on to his own. I could see him being like the flagship artist on like a Shrapnel Records or something like that, doing these cool kind of neoclassical metal type things where he could basically do whatever he wanted, right? I could totally see that. And where that would take him, I don't know. But I mean, that would carry him through the rest of the 80s for sure. And, does he become like that de facto instrumental guitar player number one before we even get a Satriani or a Vai, right? I think so.
Yeah. A funny thing with him is I've gotten the impression over time, and again from interviews and stuff, like who was it? Was it Kevin Dubrow telling me this? But just that he was still young, but he was kind of like a bit of an unformed personality as well. He was kind of like naive and strange and obscure, and they mentioned like they would just like steal stuff and be kleptomaniacs for fun, and at parties or whatever, and so yeah, there was just this weird there's this odd part of his personality that say had he gotten into drugs and drink in a big way, he could have gone down a really bad path. But would he have matured and stabilized? Because we hear Jake E. Lee is a little bit of an obscure guy as well. He's a little bit of an artistic, creative type, right?
Yep.
So you wonder how Randy would have navigated the industry moving forward, if he would have become like a difficult guy, or if he would have like grown into himself as an adult sort of situation. But it seemed like the most grounded career thing for him to do would have been a nice structure for him as he's building his personality to stay in Aussie and get a catalog under his belt, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. All right, Tommy Bolin. Of course, Tommy rose from obscurity and joined the James Gang a couple albums after Joe Walsh left, started making a name for himself there. Of course, he joined Deep Purple for the Come Taste the Band album to replace Ritchie Blackmore. He's got the Teaser and Private Eyes albums, which got him a good amount of notoriety. Of course, he was plagued with really bad addictions to heroin and whatnot, which derailed his career and ultimately led to his downfall. But I think that he was onto some cool stuff on these albums. Really a guy that really talented guitar player who could also sing, who didn't really stick in one genre, right? I mean, these albums, you listen to them, there's rock, there's blues, there's little bits of jazz and pop and funk. It's like all this kind of thing. I definitely think he would have kind of continued on as a solo artist. My guess is that he would have been a guitar player in Whitesnake at some point in time had he lived, Martin. I really think that was inevitable. Where he goes in the 80s, I don't really know where he fits in. Does he become kind of like a Stevie Ray Vaughan type of guy, solo artist? It's possible. Does he put together a band that becomes something big in the 80s? Does he fit into the hair metal scene? I don't know. Arguably, my guess is still he makes a name for himself even more in Whitesnake, I think, and he becomes kind of like co-leader of that band with Coverdale, but that's a story for another day. So, I definitely think we would have seen a lot more from Tommy Bolin, other than these two solo albums and what he did in those other collaborations. But, another talented guy that there's not enough to really judge how great he might have been, but we'll never know.
So do you think we get more Deep Purple albums, or?
I don't think so. I think that was going to go south regardless. I really think that Deep Purple, regardless of whether he died and his addictions were that bad, I think that they were going to break up anyway, because to me, I always get the impression that Pace and Lord were kind of like, all right, this is getting too far removed from what we always wanted to do in Purple. So I think the disillusionment of those two guys was always going to break up that band. But I think if he lived, either he was going to go do some stuff with Glenn Hughes, but again, then you got Glenn Hughes's problem, right? So I don't know. Or I think him and Coverdale go forward and do some stuff together, because to me, listening to all the stuff that Tommy has done up until his death, I think that his style of guitar playing would have fit pretty well in Whitesnake, alongside like a Mickey Moody or a Bernie Marsden, at least initially, or him as the only guy, who knows, right? But I think Purple was going to end regardless. I think that time for that band was done.
Cool. Wicked. All right. Well, that's 10 each.
Yeah. You want to rattle off a couple of quick other ones, Martin, or?
Well, yeah, we had a long list here of I started putting together a list. We'll just let's literally limit this to A and B, say. Joey Alves from Yesterday and Today, or Y&T, Sid Barrett, Stiv Bators, which you wouldn't know anything about, but Dead Boys, right? That whole situation. David Bowie, what would have happened there? Clive Burr. And the rest actually you did talk about there, but Sid Barrett, what do you think would have happened with Sid?
Yeah, I mean, would we ever get David Gilmour in the band, right? Does Pink Floyd ever become the huge band that they became? I don't know. I think if Sid was still don't get me wrong, Sid Barrett, awesome guy, really unique talent, but I don't know if having him as the driving force in Pink Floyd ever gets them to where they eventually got without him. Don't think
Maybe
so.
He's a psych guy. He's of the 60s. So as you get into the 70s and Floyd becomes this strange krautrock prog band, he doesn't fit in, or they keep making psych and psych gets out of date and they don't go anywhere, right?
Yeah, because I could see them becoming like a Hawkwind, right? And, Hawkwind, a great cult band, but never a big group. So yeah, that's an interesting one, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's a ton of others.
Yeah. We'll leave them. They may happen for another show. This was a
Yeah.
long list here we made. So
I know,
yeah,
and I'm sure someone's going to say, "Oh, you didn't mention Jimi Hendrix." Well, I thought of Jimi Hendrix. That was like the obvious one. I think Hendrix would have gone and done a lot of cool things, and I think he would have done that album with Miles Davis that it's always talked about that I know Miles really wanted. But we could do a whole episode on what Jimi Hendrix could have done.
yeah.
So, yeah,
I'll mention one more because I think I forgot to include him in my 10 because I was going to, but Jim Morrison's a funny one, right?
yeah,
Where I almost wonder what in the world would they have made in the 70s as the 70s rolled on, right? They're just such a strange, obscure band with this really weird sound. You could say it's a 60s sound, but it's just so weird that you don't know what to pin it to. But what would that guy have done in the 70s and 80s? Wow, that's
yeah. I mean, the one thing I think his kind of songwriting kind of habits and the way he does this kind of poetry. I mean, he would have had plenty of ammunition for his lyrics, I think, with like the end of the Vietnam War and Watergate and all that kind of stuff. So I think that we would have gotten some interesting lyrical concepts from him. But yeah, their music is just so part of that era. I really can't see the Doors becoming much of a force in like 1975 or something like that. It just seems kind of so from that time, and it's almost like a time capsule thing. It's like it's like you can't take the Doors music and put it into the late 70s or the 80s. I just can't imagine. I don't think I've ever even thought about it. It's like you just take for granted that the Doors are from those handful of years and that's it, right? And him as well.
maybe he joins Black Sabbath and Ronnie James Dio doesn't have a job.
Could you imagine that? I'm trying to picture Jim Morrison singing War Pigs right now. And I'm kind of like, that would be really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Get on that AI.
I was just gonna say. So now we've given people the idea. So next week we'll see this video. Jim Morrison singing War Pigs, right? It's like crazy. So yeah, stay tuned for part 2 of this next week, where we'll be moving away from folks that died to scenarios. What if scenarios revolving bands and lineups and albums and all that sort of thing. So stay tuned for that. Martin, you want to plug some stuff?
I'm not pretty well. Yeah, I guess I had my thing where I was going to go through a book at a time, but I kind of forgot that. So I'll just mention one off the top of my head. So yeah, it's the 30th anniversary of all my books. You can see all my books, the ones that are printed at martinpopoff.com. But another super old one that I really like is the Who Invented Heavy Metal book. That's one that came up in discussion again on Facebook again. So that's still available. That's an older title. It's got the Black Sabbath, mill thing, a picture that was taken by Monty Connor, good friend of ours, right? But yeah, that's a book of 120,000 words that ends in 1971. It's just a super detailed timeline of the whole history of the invention of heavy metal. So that's the one book I'll mention there. And we've got the Contrarians show, of course, and we've got my audio podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff.
I think that book is one of the only ones that I don't have. I don't know why I don't have it, because every time it comes up in a conversation, I look over and I'm like, damn, why did I never get that one? I need to take care of that.
Pete, an actually cool thing. I don't know why I have this, but for some reason I have like I have a whole PDF of that, which rings in at only 7 megabytes. So I'm just going to email it to you.
Okay.
And you'll have it's really weird. I've never seen how anybody could make a PDF that is that small that fits, but it's all there. All the pictures are there. So it's like weird. I open up my folder. It's like, I got a 7 megabyte PDF for this. Okay, well, so wow. I've shared it with people, so I'm going to send it to you right now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I definitely want to read that, because that's that's a sweet spot right there. Those glory years of heavy music, right? So yeah. All right, what do we got coming up here on the channel? So, of course, tune in just a couple hours this afternoon. We'll have the next episode of The Professor's Picks. Ken Golden will be coming into the house and, well, not into my house, but into the Zoom house, I guess, to talk about new releases for this Friday, which is the 21st of July. Let's think about that for a second. And then we've got this weekend, we have the next installment of It's All About the Fuzz with Karen LaPreziosa and myself. We'll be talking about some cool bands from the Rise Above Records roster. So tune in for that on Saturday, tomorrow, and then Sunday, Jamie Laszlo will be back and we'll be ranking the albums of Blood Ceremony. Really cool, kind of psychedelic doom, occult folk band. They do all sorts of things really, really well. Very cool band with a 5-album catalog. So that'll be coming up on Sunday. So till then, visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, all together, all the damn time. Thanks for subscribing. If you haven't, please do so. Click on that notification bell so you get alerted of all of our content as it posts. And please hit the like button before you leave. Stay tuned for part 2 of this episode, the what if scenarios with Martin Popoff. Till then, I am Pete Pardo. Have a good one, everybody. Take care.